Imagine the darkness of a freezing winter night broken not by the sunrise, but by the horrific, crackling glow of your own village burning to ash. You are dragged by the hair into the freezing snow, the deafening roar of galloping hooves and unfamiliar war cries drowning out the screams of everyone you have ever known. You are forced to your knees, watching everything you love violently destroyed, only to realize the true nightmare has not even begun. For centuries, history has whispered of the terrifying horsemen of the Eurasian steppe, the Mongols, the Xiongnu, the Tatars and the Scythians, and their brutally efficient conquests. We are taught about the millions of men who fell beneath their rain of arrows, and the great cities reduced to rubble. But the darkest, most agonizing chapter of these conquests has been quietly glossed over in the history books. What actually happened to the hundreds of thousands of women they took alive? Most assume they were simply killed, or perhaps forced into servitude in some distant, wind-swept tent. But the reality of their fate was a systemic, multi-layered horror so psychologically and physically devastating that contemporary chroniclers wrote that the dead were the lucky ones. There was an entire hidden economic and cultural machine built upon their stolen lives, leading to a fate far worse than the immediate mercy of a sword. It is a story of absolute erasure, of sprawling underground empires built on human currency, and of a slow, agonizing descent into a world where human beings were transformed into ghosts while their bodies still breathed. But to truly understand the unimaginable torment these women faced, we must first look at the very soil that birthed this terror, because a storm had been brewing on the horizon for generations, and the settled world was completely unprepared for the tempest that was about to strike. To comprehend this forgotten tragedy, you must picture the vast, unbroken ocean of the Eurasian steppe, stretching from the borders of modern-day Hungary all the way to the coast of China. It is an unforgiving, seemingly endless sea of tall grass, biting winds, and extreme temperatures. For thousands of years, this harsh landscape forged a specific type of human existence. While the rest of the world settled down, building walls, planting crops, and writing laws, the people of the steppe remained in perpetual motion. They lived in the saddle, mastering horseback archery before they could even walk. They did not measure wealth in gold or land, but in herds, horses, and human captives. Bordering this restless ocean of nomads were the sedentary, agricultural civilizations, the fractured principalities of Eastern Europe, the opulent cities of Persia, and the vast agrarian empires of China. These settled people viewed the steppe with a mixture of contempt and existential dread. They built forts and watchtowers, hoping to keep the chaos at bay. But the watchtowers were never enough. The geopolitical atmosphere of the Middle Ages and the early modern period was one of constant, simmering tension. Kings and emperors played political chess, warring with their neighbors over petty borders and religious disputes, entirely distracted from the existential threat looming just beyond the horizon. The settled world was wealthy, slow, and divided. The steppe world was poor, lightning fast, and hungry. Everything was about to change. When the steppe empires, from the armies of Genghis Khan to the later raids of the Crimean Khanate, decided to move, they did not wage war like European kings. They did not march in slow columns with supply wagons, nor did they meet their enemies on designated battlefields. They moved like a force of nature, a terrifying swarm of highly disciplined, autonomous riders capable of traveling hundreds of miles in a matter of days. And when they struck, their primary objective was rarely just land. Their objective was the harvest of human beings. To the settled farmers living in the region known as the Wild Fields, the borderlands of modern-day Ukraine, Russia, and Poland, the fear of a steppe raid was a daily, suffocating reality. A farmer might go to sleep listening to the quiet rustle of the wind through the wheat, unaware that tens of thousands of light cavalrymen had already slipped past the border defenses under the cover of a moonless night. The nomads used a devastating tactic known as the sweep. They would fan out in a massive crescent formation, sometimes 50 miles wide, moving silently through the countryside. They bypassed heavily fortified castles, focusing entirely on the soft, unprotected villages. Then, at the break of dawn, the crescent would suddenly close, trapping everything and everyone inside a tightening noose of fast-moving horsemen. But no one saw what came next. The initial assault was designed to be overwhelmingly violent, a psychological shock and awe campaign meant to instantly break any will to resist. The men of the village, anyone capable of holding a pitchfork or a sword, were systematically slaughtered on the spot. The elderly and the sick, deemed useless for the grueling journey ahead, met the same bloody fate. Fire was set to the thatched roofs, erasing the only world these villagers had ever known. And then, the silence of the aftermath was broken by the weeping of the survivors. The women, the young girls, and the children were violently rounded up, their hands bound tightly with coarse ropes or raw leather thongs. In an instant, a woman who had been a mother, a wife, a daughter, with a name, a history, and a soul was stripped of her humanity. She was no longer a person. She had become livestock. She was now a commodity known as yezer, the Arabic and Turkic word for captive, a term that would soon echo through the darkest corridors of history. Yet, surviving the initial massacre was merely the prelude to a far more agonizing ordeal. The terrifying truth of the steppe raids is that the moment of capture was not the climax of the horror. It was merely the opening scene. What followed was the death march. As the raiders consolidated their human loot, they tied the captured women to the saddles of their horses. Imagine being bound by the wrists, the coarse hair of a horse's flank brushing against your freezing skin, forced to run barefoot through the snow, mud, and jagged rocks of the wilderness. The raiders moved at a blistering pace to avoid any pursuing armies. They did not stop for the weary, the injured, or the pregnant. If a woman stumbled and could not keep up, she was not untied. She was simply dragged until the earth claimed her life. The physical toll was beyond modern comprehension. The captives were fed only scraps of raw horse meat or dry millet, barely enough to keep their hearts beating. They drank from muddy puddles alongside the animals. But the physical agony, the bleeding feet, the gnawing starvation, the freezing nights spent huddled together on the open ground under the indifferent stars, paled in comparison to the psychological torment. As they were marched farther and farther away from the smoking ruins of their homes, a devastating realization began to set in. They were never going back. The geographical barrier of the steppe was so vast, so alien, that even if they managed to untie their bonds and escape into the night, they would simply starve in the endless ocean of grass. They were entirely dependent on the men who had just murdered their families. This induced a profound state of psychological collapse. The raiders knew this. They weaponized the vastness of the steppe to break the minds of their captives long before they reached their final destination. The captors would sometimes deliberately separate mothers from their children during the march, selling the infants to different bands of passing nomads to trade for fresh horses. The sounds of mothers screaming as their children were carried away into the horizon became the tragic soundtrack of the steppe trails. This deliberate fracturing of families was not just cruelty for the sake of cruelty. It was a calculated method of psychological subjugation. By stripping away every emotional anchor, every shred of hope, the raiders ensured that the women became docile, hollowed-out shells, easier to transport and easier to sell. But the women who survived this harrowing march were about to enter a world far more complex and far more cruel than they could have ever imagined. The trail they walked was leading them toward a dark epicenter of wealth and suffering, a place where their fates would be permanently sealed. The true destination of these brutal raids was not the nomadic camps of the wild steppe, but rather the glittering, stone-paved streets of distant, wealthy empires. The captives were being funneled into a massive, highly organized, and internationally sanctioned human supply chain. That decision would alter history forever, as the exhausted, traumatized survivors finally saw the glittering waters of the Black Sea on the horizon. They were herded toward the towering walls of cities like Kaffa, a bustling, cosmopolitan port controlled by wealthy Italian merchants from Genoa. Here, in the shadow of majestic cathedrals and grand trading houses, the clash of civilizations took on a sinister, mercantile form. Kaffa was the eye of a human trafficking hurricane, a place where the wild violence of the steppe met the cold, calculated capitalism of the Mediterranean world. The gates of the city opened, and the captured women were pushed into the dark, damp holding pens beneath the slave markets. The transition was jarring and terrifying. They had survived the barbarism of the raiders, only to be handed over to men in fine silks who viewed them through the cold, calculating eyes of accountants. The slave markets of Kaffa and later Istanbul were places of profound humiliation and existential dread. Here, the final remnants of a captured woman's identity were systematically stripped away. They were washed, oiled, and dressed in cheap, revealing garments designed to highlight their physical attributes for prospective buyers. The buyers were a diverse and wealthy elite: Ottoman officials, Venetian merchants, Egyptian Mamluks, and wealthy Persian landowners. The women were forced to stand on raised wooden platforms, subjected to the invasive, degrading hands of strangers who inspected their teeth, felt their muscles, and coldly calculated their worth based on their age, beauty, and perceived fertility. It was an environment designed to make the captive feel entirely powerless, a mere object placed on a shelf. But there was a darker reason these markets were so highly organized. a secret economic engine that was quietly dictating the fate of empires, and the women standing on those wooden blocks held the key to a massive shift in global power. The staggering truth was that these massive, expanding empires did not just want cheap agricultural labor or domestic servants. They were fundamentally rebuilding their entire aristocratic and royal bloodlines through the bodies of these stolen women. The elite classes of the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern worlds had grown deeply paranoid of rival noble families and internal political uprisings. To consolidate absolute power, they decided to completely bypass traditional aristocratic marriages. Instead, they purchased their wives and concubines from the slave markets, ensuring that the mothers of the next generation of generals, governors, and even emperors had no powerful local families to back them, no political alliances, and no loyalties other than to the master who owned them. The women standing trembling on the auction blocks of Kaffa were not merely captives. They were the raw biological and cultural fuel for the most powerful empires on earth, and for the women who were deemed the most beautiful, the most intelligent, or the most resilient, a very specific and terrifying fate awaited them, one wrapped in silk and suffocating luxury. When the gold coins changed hands and the final transaction was made, the captive was led away from the cacophony of the market, through winding stone streets, and eventually behind the massive, iron, reinforced doors of a wealthy estate or an imperial palace. As those heavy doors slammed shut and the heavy locks turned, the woman crossed a threshold from which she would never return. She had entered the gilded cage of the harem. Western romanticism has spent centuries painting the harem as a sensual, leisurely paradise filled with exotic luxury, but the historical reality was a high-stakes, ruthless political prison. It was here that the true punishment, the fate worse than death, was meticulously administered. Death on the steppe would have been a finite ending, a brutal but brief physical pain. But the harem demanded something far more terrifying: the absolute, systematic assassination of the captive's identity. The moment she entered, her old life was officially declared dead. Everything was about to change. The violent erasure began with her very name. The name her mother gave her, the name she was called in her village, was forbidden. She was stripped of her torn, travel-stained clothes and forcibly bathed, her skin scrubbed with harsh soaps and scented oils to wash away the scent of the steppe and her past. Then, she was given a new name, usually Persian or Arabic, something poetic and docile like Spring Rose or Morning Star. If she ever spoke her original name, or the names of the family members she had watched die in the snow, she was severely punished. Next came her soul. She was forced to convert to the religion of her captors, kneeling and reciting prayers in a language she did not understand to a god she did not know. Her native tongue was beaten out of her. Speaking the language of her ancestors was strictly prohibited. She had to learn the complex, highly formal language of the imperial court, mastering a new vocabulary of submission. Imagine the psychological torture of this existence. You are trapped in a breathtakingly beautiful palace, surrounded by intricately tiled walls, soothing fountains, and the heavy scent of burning incense. Yet you are completely and utterly alone. You must smile at the men who represent the very system that slaughtered your father and brothers. You must wear their clothes, speak their words, and pretend to be grateful for the velvet chains that bind you. You become an imposter in your own body, forced to act out a lifelong performance to simply stay alive. This was the living death. The woman she once was had been effectively buried alive, replaced by an artificial construct designed entirely for the pleasure and political utility of her owners. The trauma of this complete psychological annihilation was so profound that many women simply lost their minds, wandering the vast corridors of the palaces like hollow ghosts, their spirits entirely broken. But no one saw what came next. The harem was not a sisterhood of shared trauma. It was an incredibly vicious, hyper-competitive hierarchy where survival depended on ruthless cunning. At the bottom were the raw captives, the newly arrived girls who scrubbed the floors and served the older women. Above them were the favored concubines, and at the very top was the mother of the master, a woman who wielded absolute, terrifying authority over every breathing soul within the walls. To escape the brutal physical labor and daily humiliations of the lowest ranks, a captive had to catch the eye of the master. She had to actively court the favor of the man who owned her, fighting against the hundreds of other enslaved women for his fleeting attention. And if she succeeded, she was plunged into an even deadlier game. The ultimate goal, the only true path to any semblance of security, was to bear the master a son. But bringing a child into this dark world unleashed a new nightmare of anxiety and terror. In many of these empires, particularly the Ottoman system, succession was not guaranteed to the oldest son. It was a brutal, Darwinian struggle where the surviving sons would eventually fight to the death for the throne, a legally sanctioned practice of royal fratricide. If a captive woman managed to bear a son, she knew that his life and her own survival depended entirely on him eliminating all his half-brothers. The gentle girls who had been stolen from quiet farming villages were forced to transform into fiercely manipulative political operators. They formed shadowy alliances, bribed the eunuch guards, intercepted letters, and whispered poison into the ears of their masters, all to protect their children from assassination. They learned to hide deadly poisons in their ornate rings and to smile warmly at rival concubines while plotting their downfall. The innocence of the captive was replaced by a cold, calculating ruthlessness born of sheer desperation. Yet, hidden within this terrifying crucible of survival, a massive secret was brewing. While the emperors and sultans believed they were in absolute control, sitting on their heavily guarded thrones and dictating the laws of the known world, they had inadvertently brought their most dangerous adversaries directly into the heart of their empires. They had kidnapped the most resilient, hardened survivors of the steppe raids and placed them at the very center of political power. As the decades passed, a silent revolution began to take shape behind the heavy velvet curtains of the harem. Some of these women, stripped of their identities and forced into total submission, began to realize that the intimacy they shared with the most powerful men on earth was a weapon. They realized that the hands that poured the wine and stroked the hair of the emperor could also guide his armies and dictate his foreign policy. That decision would alter history forever. A profound shift began to occur, entirely hidden from the public eye. The enslaved women started to slowly, methodically hijack the machinery of the empires that had bought them. But how exactly did a nameless captive, traumatized and isolated, rise to command the armies of the men who enslaved her? And what happened when the victims of the steppe raids finally got their hands on the levers of absolute power? The answer to that mystery involves one of the most astonishing political coups in human history, an era where the fate of millions would be decided by the whispered commands of the very women who were supposed to have been erased from existence. To understand how a traumatized, nameless captive could orchestrate a silent revolution, we must look at the astonishing true story of the era that historians now call the Sultanate of Women. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the vast and terrifying Ottoman Empire, a superpower that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of North Africa, experienced a bizarre political inversion. The sultans, isolated by their immense power and increasingly paranoid, retreated deep into the inner sanctums of their palaces, relying entirely on their most trusted confidantes, and who were the only people allowed absolute, unhindered access to the most powerful men on earth. The enslaved concubines of the imperial harem. What began as an institution designed for subjugation inadvertently became an incubator for arguably the most concentrated female political power in the early modern world. These women, many of them captured as young girls in the brutal raids across the Eastern European steppe, began to quietly pull the strings of the empire, transforming their gilded cages into the true command centers of the global stage. The turning point occurred with a woman known to history as Roxolana, originally named Anastasia. Captured in a bloody Tatar raid in a small Ruthenian village in what is now Ukraine, she endured the horrific death march, the degrading slave markets of Kaffa, and the terrifying induction into the imperial harem of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. By all accounts, she should have been just another face lost in the crowd of hundreds of concubines, destined for a life of quiet servitude and eventual obscurity. But no one saw what came next. Anastasia possessed a brilliant, razor-sharp intellect and a profound understanding of human psychology, forged in the fires of her traumatic survival. She realized that the Sultan was a lonely man surrounded by sycophants who told him only what he wanted to hear. Instead of merely offering physical submission, she offered him an intellectual equal. She learned the complex courtly language, engaged him in discussions of poetry and philosophy, and provided him with shrewd, unvarnished political advice. She slowly made herself indispensable to him, in an unprecedented move that shocked the entire empire and defied centuries of tradition. Suleiman freed her from slavery and legally married her, giving her the title of Haseki Sultan, or imperial consort. The captive had become the queen. Roxolana's rise shattered the invisible ceiling of the harem and established a blueprint for the women who would follow her. She convinced Suleiman to let her remain in the main palace in Istanbul, instead of being sent away to the provinces with her sons, ensuring she remained at the very center of political gravity. From her opulent chambers, she began to dictate foreign policy. She corresponded directly with foreign kings, such as the King of Poland, negotiating peace treaties and securing her home region from further raids. She funded massive public works projects, building hospitals, soup kitchens, and grand mosques, carefully crafting a public image of immense piety and power. But behind closed doors, she was ruthlessly securing her bloodline's future. She orchestrated the downfall and execution of Suleiman's most trusted Grand Vizier and manipulated the execution of Suleiman's eldest son by another concubine, ensuring that her own son would inherit the throne. The farmer's daughter from the steppe had single-handedly rewritten the succession of the greatest empire on earth. Following Roxolana, a succession of incredibly powerful captive women took the reins. Women like Nurbanu, a captured Venetian noblewoman, and Safai, an Albanian captive, ruled as Valide sultans, or queen mothers. Because the sultans during this period were often young, weak, or mentally unstable, these queen mothers became the de facto rulers of the empire. They appointed the generals, dictated taxation, declared wars, and held audiences with foreign ambassadors from behind heavy, veiled screens. The ambassadors of Venice, France, and England quickly learned that if they wanted a treaty signed or a trade route opened, they had to bypass the sultan and bribe the queen mother. These women commanded immense personal fortunes, controlling trade routes and estates that generated staggering wealth. They had their own private networks of spies, eunuchs, and loyal military officers, creating a shadow government operating within the walls of the palace. That decision would alter history forever. The incredible irony of the Sultanate of Women was that the very system designed to strip these captives of their power had instead given them the keys to the kingdom. The massive military machine of the empire, the very armies that had sanctioned the brutal steppe raids that destroyed their families, were now taking marching orders from the survivors of those very raids. However, this power came with a terrifying caveat. They were holding a tiger by the tail. Their immense authority was entirely unofficial and heavily resented by the traditional, male-dominated power structures of the empire. The religious scholars, the viziers, and the elite janissary military corps. To maintain their grip, these women had to rule with absolute, unflinching ruthlessness. They lived in a constant state of paranoia, knowing that a single misstep, a military defeat, or a shift in the sultan's mood could result in a sudden and violent death. Poisoned coffee, sudden strangulations by deaf-mute assassins in the dead of night, and mysterious drownings in the Bosphorus Strait were common occupational hazards for the women who dared to play the Game of Thrones. The climax of this extraordinary era arrived with Kayosem Sultan, arguably the most powerful and ruthless woman in Ottoman history. Captured as a young Greek girl named Anastasia, she rose to become the queen mother and ruled the empire through her sons and grandson for nearly half a century. Kayosem survived assassinations, military revolts, and palace coups by deploying a terrifying mix of strategic brilliance and cold-blooded violence. During a massive rebellion, when the soldiers demanded the heads of her closest allies, she calmly threw their severed heads over the palace walls to appease the mob. Buying herself time to regroup, she ruled with an iron fist, stabilizing the empire during a period of immense crisis. But the higher she climbed, the more isolated she became. As Kayosem grew older, she refused to relinquish power to her young grandson's mother, another ambitious captive named Turan. The palace became a lethal battleground between the aging, established queen mother and the rising, desperate young mother. The tension inside the harem reached a boiling point, creating a suffocating atmosphere of dread. The ultimate confrontation between these two incredibly powerful women would decide the future of the empire, and the resulting violence would signal the end of the Sultanate of Women, leaving a legacy written in both immense glory and staggering bloodshed. But what exactly transpired on that fateful night in the dark corridors of the palace? And how did the legacy of these extraordinary survivors reshape the modern world? The violent conclusion of their story reveals the ultimate cost of surviving the living death. The final, devastating chapter of the Sultanate of Women unfolded not on a battlefield, but within the suffocating, opulent confines of the Topkapi Palace, deep in the heart of Istanbul. It was a climax of pure, concentrated political terror. By 1651, the aging Queen Mother Kayosem Sultan, who had masterfully controlled the Ottoman Empire for nearly half a century, found herself locked in a lethal power struggle with her own daughter-in-law, Turan Sultan. Turan, originally a Ruthenian captive named Nadia who had survived the same brutal steppe raids and slave markets as her predecessors, was fiercely protective of her young son, the new Sultan Mehmed IV. She recognized that as long as Kayosem lived, She and her son were in imminent danger of being replaced or assassinated, a common fate for those who threatened the old regime's grip on power. Everything was about to change. The tension within the harem had become unbearable. The palace was divided into two heavily armed, deeply paranoid factions. Eunuchs, guards, and concubines were forced to choose sides, whispering secrets and passing encrypted messages in the dimly lit corridors. Qasem, realizing that Turan was successfully building a coalition against her, made a chilling, calculated decision. She plotted to dethrone her young grandson, Mehmed Ivy, and replace him with another, more pliable prince, which would inevitably mean the execution of both the young sultan and Turan. However, in the high-stakes game of harem politics, secrets rarely stayed buried. One of Qasem's own servants, a woman whose loyalty she had taken for granted, betrayed the plot to Turan. But no one saw what came next. In the dead of night on September 2, 1651, the palace erupted into sudden violent chaos. Turan, realizing she had only hours before Qasem's assassins struck, launched a preemptive strike. She rallied her loyal eunuchs and armed them. They moved silently through the labyrinthine halls of the harem, bypassing the sleeping guards, and broke into Qasem's private chambers. The ensuing scene was a terrifying realization of the ultimate cost of absolute power. The great Qasem Sultan, the woman who had commanded armies and dictated the fate of millions, was found hiding in a closet. In a desperate, undignified struggle, the aging Queen Mother was dragged out by Turan's loyalists. The details of her death are notoriously brutal. She was strangled not with the traditional silk bowstring reserved for royalty, but with the heavy curtains of her own bedchamber, or perhaps even her own hair, by the very men she had once commanded. That decision would alter history forever. With Qasem's violent death, Turan Sultan emerged as the undisputed Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, and the supreme ruler of the empire. She had won the ultimate game of survival, but the blood spilled that night marked the beginning of the end for the Sultanate of Women. Turhan, having witnessed the devastating consequences of unchecked power struggles within the harem, made a monumental decision that would reshape the Ottoman Empire. In 1656, facing military crisis and economic collapse, she voluntarily handed over the absolute executive power she had fought so hard to win. She appointed an incredibly capable, ruthless Grand Vizier named Khosrow Mehmed Pasha and granted him unprecedented dictatorial powers to stabilize the empire. Turan retreated from the daily administration of the state, focusing instead on massive philanthropic projects and the construction of the colossal new mosque in Istanbul, cementing her legacy not as a tyrant, but as a pious builder. The era of women actively directing the fate of the empire from behind the veil had effectively ended. The Grand Viziers and the bureaucracy reasserted control, and the sultans eventually began to slowly emerge from their gilded cages, though the empire would never fully regain the terrifying, expansionist momentum it had during the height of the Sultanate of Women. However, the legacy of these extraordinary women, Roxolana Nurbanu, Safai, Qasem, and Turhan, extends far beyond the political history of a single empire. Their lives represent one of the most astonishing paradoxes in human history. They were victims of a brutal, industrialized system of human trafficking, subjected to a fate worse than death, the complete systematic annihilation of their identities, their families, and their freedom. Yet, from the absolute depths of that despair, they forged a path to unimaginable power. They did not just survive the living death of the harem, they weaponized it. They utilized the only tools available to them: intelligence, psychological manipulation, ruthlessness, and an iron will to conquer their conquerors. Their stories force us to reconsider the traditional narratives of history, which so often focus exclusively on the men who rode the horses, fired the cannons, and signed the treaties. The true hidden engine of the early modern world was often fueled by the silent, desperate struggles of the women who were stolen to build it. They were the invisible architects of empires, the mothers of kings, and the silent directors of global politics. When we look back at the horrific reality of the steppe raids, the burning villages, the agonizing death marches, and the degrading slave markets of Kaffa, we must also remember the women who refused to be erased. They were forced to endure a total, traumatic rebirth, stripped of everything they knew, only to emerge as the most powerful women on earth. Their legacy is a profound testament to the terrifying, indomitable resilience of the human spirit. It is a story of how, even in the darkest, most oppressive systems ever designed to break the human soul, the will to survive, to protect one's children, and to eventually dominate, can never truly be extinguished. The silence of the steppe was ultimately broken not just by the thunder of hooves, but by the quiet, strategic whispers of the women who survived it. whispers that echoed through palaces, changed the course of civilization, and continue to resonate through history, reminding us that true power is rarely found where we expect it to be.